He didn't forge a document or crack a safe. He bought a second-hand army uniform, and an entire town handed him its treasury. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. A middle-aged man in the coat of a Prussian captain stopped a handful of soldiers in the street. He had no written orders. He had no real rank. He had spent most of his life in prison, and he had never commanded anything larger than a shoemaker's bench. And yet, on the strength of the cloth on his shoulders, those soldiers fell in behind him without a single question. He marched them to a town hall on the edge of Berlin. He arrested the mayor. He arrested the treasurer. He emptied the town's cash box, and then, calm as a clerk, he wrote out a receipt for the money he was stealing. Not one official in that building asked to see a piece of paper that gave him the right. His name was Wilhelm Voigt. He was 57 years old, a cobbler with a criminal record longer than his arm, and for a few hours on the 16th of October, 1906, he became the most obeyed man in the German Empire. He did not do it by being brilliant. He did it by wearing the right coat in a country that had been trained from birth to obey it. This is the story of the Captain of Köpenick. Friedrich Wilhelm Voigt was born on the 13th of February, 1849, in Tilsit, in the far east of Prussia. His father mended shoes for a living, and Wilhelm learned the same trade. A cobbler's son, a cobbler himself. That should have been the whole of it. But at 14 years old, he was already standing in front of a judge, sentenced to 2 weeks for theft. And from there, his life set into a pattern he could not break. Theft, burglary, forgery, one sentence after another, stacked across nearly 30 years. He once drew 15 years in a single stretch for trying to break into the cash office of a court, of all places. By the time the counting was done, he had spent more than 2 decades of his life behind bars. By some accounts, closer to 27 years. Think about what that does to a man. He walked into prison as a boy and came out again and again, a little older, a little stranger to the ordinary world. He had no family life, no trade to speak of, no settled home. He had a record, and in the Germany of that time, a record followed you like a shadow. On the 12th of February, 1906, the doors opened one more time. Wilhelm Voigt, 57 years old, walked out into a country that had one last rule waiting for him. A rule that would leave him no legal way to exist. To live and work in Imperial Germany, you needed papers, a residence permit. And to get a residence permit, you needed proof of honest work. And to get honest work, an employer had to see that you were properly registered. For an ordinary man, this was a formality. For an ex-convict, it was a locked room with no door. No employer wanted a man with Voigt's record. And without work, the police would not grant him the right to stay. Without the right to stay, he was an undesirable, to be moved along. In August of 1906, the Berlin police expelled him from the city outright. The state had, in the plainest terms, made his existence against the law. One museum that tells his story sums up the trap in 4 short lines. No residence, no job. No job, no residence. No residence, no passport. By his own telling, this is where the whole scheme was born. What he wanted, more than money, was a passport. A single stamped page that would let him cross a border, start again, and finally step outside the paper trap that was quietly erasing him. That, the story goes, was the prize. Everything he did next, the uniform, the soldiers, the town hall, was aimed at one small document. It is worth remembering that, because of where he chose to go looking for it, here is the idea that came to him, and it was almost philosophical. If a piece of paper could erase him, then a piece of cloth could turn him into anyone. He got hold of a second-hand captain's uniform, the kind worn by an officer of the Prussian Guards. Some say he pieced it together from different shops, a coat here, a cap there. Some say he picked the whole thing up from a junk dealer in Potsdam. The details are murky, and honestly, they don't matter. What matters is what that uniform was, in that time and that place. In Imperial Germany, an officer's uniform was not a costume. It was portable authority. A captain of the guards could give orders to men who had never met him, and they would obey, because the coat outranked the man inside it. Nobody looked at the face. Everybody looked at the shoulders. Voigt had spent his life on the receiving end of that authority. He had watched, from prison yards and police stations, exactly how it worked. He understood something the respectable people around him never had to notice. In Prussia, obedience was not a choice you made. It was a reflex drilled in so deep that the man giving the command barely mattered. All you needed was the right coat, worn with a straight face. On the 16th of October, he put it on. He did not have a single soldier when he started. He simply went and collected them off the street. Near a set of barracks, he stopped a small squad of grenadiers, 4 of them, with a sergeant. On the strength of the uniform alone, he took command. He told the sergeant to report back to his superiors and sent him on his way. Then, near a shooting range, he gathered up 6 more men. Nobody asked for written orders. Nobody asked who he was. He was a captain, and they were soldiers. And that was the whole conversation. By the time he was done, he had about 10 or 11 men fallen in behind him, rifles on their shoulders, waiting to be told what to do. So he told them. They were on special orders, he said. They were to follow him, and they were to keep their mouths shut. He marched his borrowed army onto a train and out to Köpenick, a quiet town on the water at the edge of Berlin. There he posted guards at the doors of the town hall, walked inside and took the place over. No shots, no struggle. A middle-aged cobbler in a bought coat had just occupied a seat of government with soldiers he had met an hour before. And the men in that building, the clerks, the officials, the mayor himself, did the one thing their whole world had trained them to do. They obeyed. The mayor of Köpenick was a man named Georg Langerhans, and here the trap closes in the most perfect way. Langerhans was himself a former officer of the Prussian Reserve. He knew in his bones what a captain's epaulets meant. So when this captain announced that he was placing him under arrest for irregularities in the town accounts, the mayor did not argue. He stood up and he submitted. A trained officer surrendering to a stranger because the stranger wore the right coat. Voigt arrested the town treasurer too, a man named von Wiltberg, on the same invented pretext. Then he had the cash box brought to him and counted out the town's money. The records say it came to 3,557 marks and 45 pfennigs. And then he did the thing that turned a robbery into a legend. He asked for pen and paper, and he wrote out a receipt. He signed it with a false officer's name, a name that, reportedly, belonged to one of his own former prison governors. The receipt he left behind recorded a larger sum, something close to 4,000 marks, more money than was actually in the box. That gap between the real take and the famous round number has trailed the story ever since. He sent the mayor and the treasurer off to Berlin under armed guard for questioning that would never come. He dismissed his soldiers. He walked to the station, changed out of the uniform and into plain clothes, and simply vanished into the city. He had what he came for. Almost. Remember what he was supposedly after. A passport, the one document that would set him free. Here is the joke at the center of the whole affair. The Köpenick town hall did not issue passports. It never had. The office that could grant the thing he wanted was not in that building at all. It sat at the far end of the district under a different authority entirely. Voigt had commandeered an army, seized a town hall, and arrested its mayor in the one place for miles around that could not give him the single piece of paper he claimed to want. He walked away with the cash. He never got the pass. The escape held for 10 days. Then it fell apart the ordinary way. A former cellmate, a man who had heard Voigt talk through the plan behind bars, went to the police for the reward money. On the 26th of October, 1906, they came for him. No siege, no chase. They simply arrested Wilhelm Voigt, quietly, over his breakfast. The trial came fast. On the 1st of December, the court sentenced him to 4 years in prison for impersonating an officer, for forgery, and for unlawful imprisonment. 4 years for putting on a coat and asking a country to obey it. The law had reached its verdict, but the public had already reached a very different one, and their verdict was the thing Voigt never saw coming. Something strange happened while Voigt sat in his cell. The country fell in love with him. The newspapers could not get enough of the little cobbler who had made fools of the Prussian army and the Prussian state without firing a shot. He had held a mirror up to the most disciplined nation in Europe, and the reflection was ridiculous. And the joke reached all the way to the top. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the man at the head of that whole machine of uniforms and obedience, is said to have laughed out loud when he heard the story. An amiable scoundrel. That is the phrase the Kaiser is supposed to have used for him. We should be careful with it. It comes down to us as rumor more than record, the kind of line an empire tells about itself when it would rather laugh than look in the mirror. But whether or not those exact words were ever spoken, the sentiment behind them was real enough to change Voigt's fate. On the 16th of August, 1908, after he had served about 20 months of his sentence, Wilhelm II pardoned him. The Emperor of Germany personally set the man loose. The con had been so complete, so embarrassing, and so genuinely funny that the state decided the kindest thing it could do was pretend it had all been a good joke on itself. Wilhelm Voigt walked out of prison a star, not a criminal in hiding, but a celebrity in demand. They put a waxwork of him in Madame Tussauds in London. He sat for photographs. In 1909, he published his life story under a title that told you exactly how he now saw himself. How I became the Captain of Köpenick. He toured. He appeared with a traveling circus, standing on a stage in the uniform that had made him, the real Captain of Köpenick, on show for the price of a ticket. The man the state could not register now sold out halls across Europe. Somewhere around 1909 or 1910, he settled in Luxembourg City, in a house on a quiet street. For a while, he lived comfortably on the fame. He even bought himself a car. It did not last forever. His savings thinned. And on the 3rd of January, 1922, Wilhelm Voigt died in Luxembourg of complications from the flu. They buried him under a headstone that got his birth year wrong and his title exactly right, the Captain of Köpenick. Years later, a playwright named Karl Zuckmayer turned his story into a stage play and made sure the world remembered not just the trick, but the trap that produced it. The man had become a folk hero. But the thing he exposed was bigger than any one man, and it is the reason we are still telling this story. So who actually pulled off the Köpenick job? It is tempting to say Wilhelm Voigt, the clever cobbler, the master of disguise, but look closely at what he really did, and the genius disappears. He did not pick a lock. He did not counterfeit an order. He did not say a single thing that a 5-minute question could not have exposed. He put on a coat and told people to obey him. That was the entire plan. The trick only worked because of who he was pointing it at. A society drilled, from the schoolroom to the barracks, to bow to a uniform without ever asking what was inside it. Soldiers who followed a stranger because his shoulders said "Captain." A mayor, a trained officer who stood and surrendered his own town rather than question a coat. The Germans had a grim word for that habit: cadaver obedience, the obedience of a corpse that does whatever it is told and asks nothing. That is the real story here, and it is why it stung so badly. Voigt did not defeat the Prussian state. The Prussian state defeated itself the moment it decided that authority was a thing you wore instead of a thing you earned. One ex-convict simply noticed and helped himself. The file on Friedrich Wilhelm Voigt of Tilsit, East Prussia. Cobbler. Convict. For a few hours on a Tuesday in October, the most obeyed man in the German Empire. Case closed.